we explore mistakes in reasoning about causation or causal fallacies that are very common. Here we'll investigate half a dozen causal fallacies. The most common causal fallacy is post hoc, which is short for post hoc ergo propter hoc. Technically, that is a Latin phrase that means after this, therefore because of this, or after it, therefore because of it. The mistake here is when you confuse a coincidental relationship with a causal relationship. This often occurs when it's concluded that A caused B merely because B happened to follow A. Now, for example, superstitions are often generated this way or reinforced this way. Somebody wears their red socks and their team wins, and then they try that again and it happens again. It's just a coincidence, but they conclude that the Red Sox caused the team to win, and that's how superstitions are born and continued. There's no relationship, of course, between someone wearing socks in one place and a team succeeding in another place. Now, it could also occur when there actually is a positive correlation between A and B, that these things do occur together commonly. You chart it out, you graph it out, there's a clear relationship, but there's no other actual reason to think there's a causal relationship. Now, when you mine data, you can find all kinds of these examples. So, for example, suppose that over one entire year, the monthly injury rate due to motor vehicle accidents in Macomb, Illinois, varies directly with the amount of fried okra eaten in Aiken, South Carolina. And they're just a perfect correspondence. Well, of course, it doesn't mean that one caused the other. That's just a mistake in reasoning. But the fact that this can occur when you have large amounts of data to work with can cause some mistakes even when somebody is highly intelligent. They're just not sure of relationships. Clearly, in this case, there's no causal relationship. Here's another example. It's Snoopy and staring at the back door, causing the supper dish to come. Of course, that doesn't always work. Or we'll just toss in another one. And remember, these videos are for educational purposes only, so no copyright infringement here. Okay, so we have the other one. I want to get married because studies show that married people are happier. And then we have Dilbert's alternative explanation that nobody wants to marry an unhappy person. And the woman in this case is making the error of post hoc. A second very common mistake or causal fallacy is ignoring a common cause. And here we're using our English label, which pretty clearly spells it out. If due to A and B occurring together, it is assumed or concluded that A causes B or B causes A, well, there may be some relevant information that's simply being ignored. Sometimes when A and B occur together, it's simply because there's a third thing, we can call it C, that causes both A and B. So, for example, the sound that a hot air balloon makes does not cause it to rise. A child could possibly make this conclusion. You hear the loud hissing sound, the hot air balloon subsequently starts to rise. But in fact, of course, the rising and the sound occur together, and the rising is preceded by the sound. So it seems to make sense, but ultimately, obviously, it's the burner firing that causes both the sound and the rising. It's not as if the sound causes the rising. Another situation or context here, red spots that a person may have related to the measles do not cause a fever, but of course the measles virus would cause both the spots and the fever. A third causal fallacy that is relatively common is to confuse cause and effect. So this occurs when A and B are in fact causally related, but B is mistaken as the cause of A instead of A being identified properly as the cause of B. So for example, if a 102-year-old person is asked the secret of her longevity and she replies that it's due to smoking for more than 80 years, well, that would be making this mistake. She's only able to smoke for over 80 years because she's lived that long. It's the other way around. It's the longevity that caused the smoking, not the smoking that caused the longevity. So in this case, they concluded that, they got it wrong. They used to say that cell phones cause cancer, and a study showed that that was not the case. But in this individual, he finds that incidences of cancer were increasing a lot in the 70s and 80s, and followed by cell phone uses. Obviously no connection there, but we can see that the cause and effect, if there was one, was reversed. A genetic fallacy is when the origin or causal source of a claim is taken as reason for accepting the claim, or in contrast, maybe denying the claim, instead of the evidence for or against the claim itself. So where you got the information, or where the person, who it was that gave you the idea, is going to be considered to be mistaken just because of who they are, right? Instead of the evidence that is provided for the claim itself. So for example, the Pythagorean theorem works, right? But somebody might say, oh, it arose among some strange ancient cults. Well, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter where it came from. It works, right? We still have evidence that it works and we can prove it. Or if somebody claimed that Catholics believe that God exists merely because they were taught to believe that by their parents, well, that doesn't give you reason to think that God does not exist. All right, the origin of the belief is not related to the evidence for or against the belief. Now, I realize when we bring up God here that this may bring in some other concerns, but anyway, if somebody thinks that that's good evidence that God doesn't exist, they've made a genetic fallacy. We would have to evaluate the existence of God, if that's what you're doing, if that's the context you're in, based on the merits of the arguments and the evidence for and against the existence of God, not on the origin of the person talking. Now, abusive ad hominems, which would be of the type we just mentioned, and fallacious appeals to authority would be examples of the genetic fallacy, right? You're considering the origin of the claim without really considering the evidence for or against the claim, or you're making a reason to think something's false just because it came from a certain place, or a reason to think something is true just because it came from a certain place. Again, we would have to go back and think about arguments for authority and evaluate those, because sometimes they can be well constructed. That's why we identify these as fallacious appeals to authority. Those are going to be committing the genetic fallacy. For example, if somebody said, well, Professor J's been cheating on his wife for years, so I shouldn't believe what he's saying about the exam coming up, right? Well, that really doesn't have any relationship between him telling the truth about the test. That would be a genetic fallacy, you're basing your belief on the origin or the source, not on the reasons there are itself for thinking the claim is true or not. A fifth fallacy is the consequential fallacy. Now, this is when you mistake a harm or a benefit from believing something with evidence for or against the belief. If you watch my video on common methods of persuasion, we discussed this there. And so, for example, believing that you'll die tomorrow, well, that might motivate you to get the most out of today, right? But that's a benefit, but that doesn't give you good evidence for thinking that you actually will die tomorrow, right? It doesn't give you reason to believe that. And finally, mistaking an originating cause with a sustaining cause. This can occur, it's not as common, but the name explains the error. You think that just because something started a process, that is the thing that maintains the process. So a match that lit the flame goes out, it's discarded. Well, if you think that because the origin is no longer there, then the flame is going to go out. Well, that's not how it works. Obviously, you can light a candle, blow out the match, and the candle will continue to stay lit. Or don't try this at home, but you can have a car that's running, remove the starter, but the car won't stop just because of that. If you believe that it will, you're committing this causal fallacy. Now, there are a few other causal fallacies, but these are the main ones that we ought to be wary of, and especially those first three: the post hoc, the ignoring a common cause, and confusing cause and effect.